Planning a trip to Paris? You'll want to listen to this episode.
If you're coming for the first time, I wouldn't come in August because it's true that a lot of Parisians still do go on vacation. A taxi can actually be faster because taxis here can use the bus and carpool lanes, but rideshares can't. Its features are really beautiful, and there's an archaeological crypt there as well, where there have been some fascinating discoveries.
Do you have any major tips for travelers visiting Paris?
So my biggest tip when you're visiting Paris.
Today, I sit down with Travel Lemming's Paris expert, Rachel Kapelke-Dale. She tells me about where to stay for multiple kinds of travelers, the best things to do in the city, safety, her biggest tips for visiting, and more. As a tourist, Paris might be one of the more overwhelming places to visit, simply because there's so much to see and do. So if you've been craving a visit to one of the most incredible cities in Europe, listen up. In addition to my interview with Rachel, Nate and I discuss Marriott's upcoming nature-focused project, a major magazine's list of the 50 best cities to visit in 2025, a writing retreat at a French castle, and more. All that coming later, but for now, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. We have tons of great episodes coming your way this year, and you won't want to miss them. I'm joined by my co-host, Nate Hake now. Nate, what's going on?
Hey, Betty, I'm doing okay. Still here in Buenos Aires, but I've got this nice for the listeners on YouTube. I'm sitting in front of a painting of the Eiffel Tower, so that's appropriate for this episode. Really looking forward to hearing what Rachel had to say about Paris. I mean, it is, of course, one of the most iconic cities. When people think about travel, probably one of the first things that come to mind. And Rachel really knows her stuff, so I haven't listened to the interview. How did it go?
The interview was great. Rachel has so many detailed tips and tricks and is just so knowledgeable about Paris in general. So I think that this interview will come in handy for anybody who's looking to visit Paris. So with that, let's jump into our discussion. Rachel Kapelke-Dale is Travel Lemming's very own Paris expert. She moved to France from Milwaukee after falling in love with the city during a study abroad program. Now she's lived there for almost 11 years. Rachel writes about the stranger side of French history in her newsletter, Beneath the Cobblestones. She has a published memoir about her early days in Paris, along with 3 novels, all of which we'll link in the show notes. Rachel's such a talented writer, which is clear from her repertoire outside of Travel Lemming, and I'm so excited to pick her brain today about Paris. She has written guides on the best things to do in Paris, where to stay throughout the city, how to visit Paris on a budget, best restaurants in Paris, and so much more. Rachel, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here. I would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on. So, yeah, as you were saying, I'm a writer who's lived in Paris for more than a decade now. I first fell in love with Paris, maybe even before study abroad, when my family came here when I was a kid, get that early imprinting in to fall in love with the city and everything French. And then having taken the language in school, it was the obvious place to study abroad, and things kind of snowballed from there. So I've written about Paris in my books. I've done walking tours of Paris for different apps. And then I've been writer with Travel Lemming now for a few years. And it's been so fun to, open up new offerings to the community, like the Paris itineraries that I've been planning, while still getting to write about just my favorite city.
Amazing. Yes. And those Paris itineraries, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so they're custom built itineraries based on the client and what they are looking for out of their Paris trip. So, when you purchase the itinerary, you get to fill out a Google form with as much or as little information as you want to tell me. You have the option to set up a video call or a voice call so I can ask you questions about, what your ideal Paris trip is. And, they start from 3 days and go on from there. So whatever you're interested in, I know the city well enough and I live here. So if I don't know, I can find it out very easily to make sure that we get you, the tours, the experiences, the kind of insider's guide to Paris, but tailored to you.
That's so cool. So I just want to start with where to stay in Paris because I know there's so many different places for so many different kinds of people in the city. So where should someone stay who has never been to Paris before?
So for first-time visitors, I like to recommend 2 areas, the Marais, which is in the 3rd and 4th arrondissement, the districts, or the 7th arrondissement. And so the Marais is on the right bank of Paris, and it is made up of those 2 neighborhoods. and it's just packed full of Parisian charm. You have a lot of little boutiques, garden squares, cafes, museums, big and small, and it's really central. So a lot of people want to stay in the first arrondissement, which is the center of the city, their first time in Paris. But I usually recommend against that because it's so busy, it's so expensive, it gets so crowded. And you're going to usually want to go in there a lot anyway on your first trip to see things like the Louvre Museum, to see a lot of major sites. So it's not far from the Marais. It's walkable from here, 15, 20 minutes. So you get much more of a neighborhood feel than you would in the first. And the seventh is the Eiffel Towers neighborhood. And it's very beautiful left bank neighborhood to stay in Paris. If you want Eiffel Tower views, that's definitely one of the places to take a look at. And it's just a different energy. It's a little more kind of manicured, openly upscale. There are lots of, embassies and stuff in the area, but it's also a really fun place to stay.
Yeah, and on the other side of that, what about for a budget traveler in Paris?
So for budget travelers, I recommend looking in the double digit arrondissement. So those go up to 20. Some of my favorites to stay in are the 11th, which is really close to the Marais. It's where I lived on my first time in Paris, and it's very, very easy to walk from there to all sorts of sites and destinations. But it's got a really neighborhoody feel. There are lots of open air markets nearby, lots of really fun things to do. But just moving out of the single digit arrondissement already, you get some savings, even though you're pretty much as central as you could be, just in the Marais a few blocks over. You are also really linked up to the Bastille, depending on where you're staying, or République, all of these areas. The 10th can also be a lot of fun to stay in. I just recommend staying away from the train stations and those areas.
Gotcha. And I was just going to ask you if you recommend avoiding any certain areas, whether it's neighborhoods or like train stations, anything like that. Are there some areas that are a little bit dicey that people shouldn't go to when they visit Paris?
Well, as I think you'll find in a lot of Western Europe, the areas around the train stations are generally not the most savory places. People will approach you very aggressively, and the thing to do is just to ignore them as much as you can. But, I've been followed. I've had, kind of scary experiences there. And I know a lot of my friends have had the same. So I like to, use the buddy system if I can, go there with a friend, try not to be there late at night. Other than that, I'd say, the only place that I really generalize about is on the périphérique, which is the highway that circles Paris. You don't want to kind of be hanging out underneath the highway or near those overpasses, particularly at night. But luckily, that's not usually on a lot of visitors' itineraries, and certainly not on the ones I plan. So that doesn't often present an issue.
Yeah, good to know. And just for listeners who might not know French words well, like myself, we'll definitely have all of these words that Rachel is saying written out on the YouTube channel. And also, I know you're going to dive into the best things to do in Paris shortly. So I know you'll kind of explain those places a little more. But I just wanted to throw that out there too about the French words because I know they're kind of difficult to understand for some of us, like myself. So you talked about some of the best places to stay. What are some other notable areas for certain kinds of travelers? I know you have a whole article on the best places to stay in Paris for so many different kinds of people. So if you could kind of discuss a little bit more about those areas and who they're tailored for.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want kind of the literary lost generation Paris, going down to the Latin Quarter and kind of the fifth and sixth arrondissement is where you're going to find that and the left bank. You'll find the Shakespeare and Company bookstore there. You'll find the Café de Flore and the Café du Magot, which were big hangouts with like Simone de Beauvoir and Ernest Hemingway and lots of famous expats as well, and in addition to Hemingway, and as well as their houses. And you can do tours of Lost Generation Paris down there. If you've been to Paris before, I like to recommend staying up in the 18th in Montmartre. It can be really fun. It can be really crowded up there on the big streets, but if you stay on a side street and you like climbing hills, it's a really great way to see a different side of almost a more village within the city, which is very charming. And if you liked Amelie, you'll see a lot of locations from Amelie up there. That's really fun. Now, the first can be crowded, but it is a good area for luxury and luxury hotels. At the Place de la Concorde by the Tuileries Gardens, you have the Ritz, and other really big famous hotels. The Ritz and its bar Hemingway, of course, for expats and locals alike, for anyone willing to spend a certain amount on a drink. I could go through all 20 if we had the time. The eighth is great for luxury shopping and for like quiet luxury on the smaller streets. Lots of peace and quiet. Gorgeous park, the Parc Monceau, with like landscaping and like little waterfalls, things like that. If you're staying with the family, going out to the 16th can be really great, especially if you're going on a day trip or several trips outside of Paris and you're driving. That's a great place to rent a car and not get stuck in Paris traffic. But you're also right between a huge park with a ton of amenities, museums, playgrounds, things like that for when the kids want to run around with your supervision, because there are some kind of unsavory parts of the park. That's the Bois de Boulogne. But you're also really well connected to central Paris by public transport and taxis. So, yeah, I'd say those are some of my top additional places to say for certain travelers.
Yeah, of course. So you mentioned like the 1st, the 8th, the 20th. Are you able to explain like how Paris is divided up into those, what is it, like sectors?
Yeah, districts, sectors, yeah. So it's Paris is divided into 20 administrative sectors. Paris, you can imagine it's like a elliptical, a misshapen circle. And right in the center of it is the first arrondissement. And from there, the numbers spiral out like a snail's shell. So you have, the 19th and the 20th, the 18th are on the edge of Paris, whereas the first, the fourth, the eighth are more centralized. So, very generally, you can say that the lower numbers are more central. But if you've never been to Paris before, I think you'd be surprised at how kind of compact and walkable the city is because it is within those limits. Just walking, the Seine cuts right through that, so the center of that circle. And walking from one end to the other would take a few hours, but it's definitely possible. Whereas doing that, say in London, would require a level of athleticism that I don't have.
Yeah, right. No, that's very interesting. So moving right along, what are some of the best things to do in Paris? I know the obvious things are visit the Eiffel Tower, maybe the Notre Dame, but you are such an expert and so many of the things you've written about, I've never even heard of before. So if you could tell us what you think are the best things to do in Paris, that would be lovely.
Absolutely. So as you said, they're the classics, the things that are on everybody's bucket list when they first come to Paris, like Notre Dame and the Louvre. So if you're connecting through Paris or you want to get the classics done quickly so that you can come back and spend more time at each one, or you're spending a day here on your way to somewhere in the countryside or another part of France, you can definitely hit the classics in a single day. So if you wanted to start out, say, at Notre Dame Cathedral, which is on one of the islands. Then you could head over out west to the Eiffel Tower, go a little bit north, you'd hit up the Arc de Triomphe. And the great things about the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, is that they're not places that you necessarily need to spend a lot of time. You can, and you can definitely dive into the history, see a bunch of different views, things like that. But they're also places that you can go up to the top if you want, and be done within, say, an hour. So from there, if you went around just a little bit to the east again, you're going back towards Notre Dame, you would actually hit the Louvre Museum. And so that would be a really fun way to end the day is walking through the Tuileries Gardens and seeing the Place de la Concorde, which is really important for the French Revolution. And I believe was one of the locations where they had the guillotine. You'll pass the Ritz Paris. You'll go by Angelina, which is known for its hot chocolate, and end up, at the Louvre, which is right there in the first. It used to be a royal palace and then got converted to a museum after the royalty was abolished in France. So the Louvre is another place where you can spend as little or really as long as you like in there. But I would definitely recommend getting a map and focusing, say, on one room in particular if you're only in Paris for the day. So that would be kind of the whistle stop tour of Paris. Another thing you can do just to see the sights from the outside is to get a ticket for the Bateau Mouche, which is the fly boats that go down the Seine River, because a lot of these monuments are along the Seine, along with the Ton More, obviously. So you can, while having dinner, while having a drink, or just seeing the sights, depending on the kind of ticket you get, you can book to go down the river and see Paris that way. And that only takes a couple of hours. So that's a great introduction to Paris. I think that also makes a great first day in Paris because again, as you go through these sites, if you want to dive deeper, then you can plan to come back later in your trip. But this gives you an overview and it also gives you a feel for the city and its geography. But yeah, I like to mix those up with some more unexpected things. So, right next to Notre Dame, or not far from Notre Dame, is Sainte Chapelle, for example, which is just huge amounts of stained glass in this gorgeous cathedral with really stunning views. So that's slightly more off the beaten path, or like the Rodin Museum, in addition to the Louvre, or instead of seeing the Louvre a second time, going to the sculptor's house down in the Seventh, and they have a huge sculpture garden set up as well, and just kind of stepping back in time, stepping into the world of that sculptor Auguste Rodin can be really fun too. There's a perfume museum here, the Fragonard Perfume Museum, that offers tours of how they make the perfume. And then you get to a little workshop where you get to create your own perfume if you book in advance. And I think that's just one of the best things to do in Paris with France's history of perfume creations and things like that. But there are all sorts of kind of unusual and unique tours that you can find. There are tours that you can do two people in a motorcycle sidecar, for example. There are all sorts of classes you can take to learn how to make anything from macaron to, pain au chocolat and chocolate croissants, baguettes, cheese tasting classes, chocolate tasting classes, all sorts of kind of learning experiences. And I love the ones where you get to take something away as well, or, like a skill or a little bottle of perfume that you've invented yourself.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. So I want to talk a little bit more about those major things like the Notre Dame just reopened, right? And for people who don't know what the Notre Dame is, which I think most of us do, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Notre Dame has got to be the most famous cathedral in Paris and probably in France. It's on one of the islands in the middle of the city. And so you often get a view of its famous flying buttresses from the quays of the Seine when you're walking along the Seine. It's very famous for being the location of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I was just back in the States, so now I want to say Notre Dame, but Notre Dame. And for being the setting of Victor Hugo's novel there. And it's architecturally stunning. Its features are really beautiful, really worth seeing. And there's an archaeological crypt there as well, where there have been some fascinating discoveries. Researchers just keep finding more and more history associated with the cathedral. And so it did catch on fire a couple of years ago. At this point, the church is repaired enough that it can have visitors again. So if you're planning on coming to Paris, you are very lucky. And I personally am planning to go in the next few days, not for the first time, but because I'm going to be writing a spotlight on Notre Dame and everything you need to know before visiting. So keep an eye out for that on the Travel Lemming site.
Yes, we'll definitely be linking any of your articles that you have regarding Paris and on Travel Lemming. So make sure to keep an eye out for those in the show notes, listeners. Laura and I actually discussed the reopening of the Notre Dame in our Lombok episode, which I highly encourage listeners to check out after listening to this one.
So a few other things that I think are really fun in that same vein are the on the side of things that are more experiences that you'll have the memories and the photographs and something to take away and go back home with. So one of my favorite things to do is to send visitors to David Mallett's salon. Now this is like the super luxury high-end salon where everybody for Paris Fashion Week goes. I believe Kate Moss goes there when she's in town. You can if you Google celebrities and David Mallet, you'll find many a Vogue article with the salon featured in it. And it's in this beautiful, like almost the whole story of this old French townhouse with original architectural details. It's in this gorgeous space. And I just love everybody there who I've ever seen for cut and color. They're just incredible. You can also see David Mallet and some of his staff at the Ritz Paris, but you do pay a premium for that. So I think you'll find, the prices are high, but reasonable and worth it at the salon in the second, the Notre Dame de Champs salon. But if you really want to go all out luxury, you can have the experience at the Ritz as well. And another thing to do that's really fun in Paris is just to, get a manicure or have a little spa service at a Parisian salon or spa. A lot of the bigger ones will have staff that does speak English on booking online, so it doesn't have to be so intimidating. I even now can be intimidated when it comes to making phone calls to book things in French. But, for example, there's a spa that I go to called Charme de l'Orient, the Charm of the Orient, in the 11th. That is just incredible with a great staff and a hammam and like a really nice, relaxing experience. So I think those are kind of fun things to work into the more classic destinations that you visit while you're here, because it also helps you take care of yourself and not just go, go, go all the time. You're having this experience that's unique to Paris while you're at the salon or at the spa, that you're also taking care of yourself and like letting everything that you've seen kind of soak in and really hit home.
Yes, yeah, we all need rest days. I like that advice. So you mentioned kind of a language barrier at times. Do most people speak English in Paris, or is it mainly French?
People who work in tourism or hospitality usually will speak some English. Once you get out of the center of the city, or especially once you get outside of Paris, it's really hit or miss. A lot of the younger generation does speak some English. With the older generation, it can be very, hit or miss. But if you have the basics, if you do Duolingo for a few weeks and, learn pleasantries and greetings, it'll get you a long way. And usually if there's more than one person working at an establishment, a store, or a restaurant, the chances are that you'll be able to make yourself understood, even if you have limited French and they have limited English.
Great. And so I've heard the stereotype that French people don't like it when you try to speak French to them. Is that true?
In my experience, it is not true. It comes about, in my opinion, as a non-French person, from the fact that French people will try to be honestly as friendly as possible and try to make things more accessible. And if they speak English very well and you only have a few words of French, they'll try to just kind of cut through, the language barrier and go to the language that's easier for everybody. But it can seem kind of harsh, when you go and you're trying, your very best with French and somebody just switches right to English. It can feel very abrupt. But I'll say, as somebody who studied French in middle school, high school, college, studied abroad here, went to graduate school here, they do it even with me. And maybe that's a commentary on the level of my French, but I prefer to think of it just as, just they're trying to make life easier for everybody.
Gotcha. So it can just kind of be misconstrued because they're a bit abrupt with it, but they're just trying not to waste any time.
I hate speaking in huge national stereotypes, but I do think that on the whole, in my personal experience, the French dislike the kind of small talk and pleasantries that we as Americans will use a lot of the time. It's not to say they don't have their own kind of codes and politenesses and, things that they'll say to, make a conversation go a certain way. But it's definitely just a cultural difference thing.
Yeah, very interesting. So you discussed a little bit earlier about potentially renting a car. And on that note, I want to talk about how to get around Paris. What are the best ways to navigate the city?
Well, a car is definitely not one of them. I don't recommend renting a car in Paris in most cases. You can check out my article on the topic to find out the exceptions. But like if you're leaving the city and, there's no train to that place, you're going to the countryside, you might rent a car in Paris and drive it out of the city. But the mayor of Paris has worked really hard to close down a lot of really congested streets, to open up more bike lanes, to make things basically harder for cars, easier for public transport, and kind of more climate friendly solutions and modes of transport. So I don't recommend that you bike in Paris, particularly if it's your first time here. But I will talk a little bit later about a bike tour of the city with an expert guide that I really love. That would be an exception to the rule. The metro and the bus are really the best ways of getting around the city. What I like about the bus is that even though it's a bit slower than the metro can be, is that you do get to see the city. Oftentimes, you'll cut through multiple arrondissements, multiple districts. You can maybe go along the Seine, all for, just a couple euros as well. What I don't like about the bus is that it's subject to delays. So if you're trying to get somewhere on time, I would say take the metro. And that's even over a taxi. I'll take a taxi or a ride share like very late at night after the metro's closed. If I have to get somewhere far away and I have a lot of bags with me, something like that. But the subway system here is so good and so fast that really, for me, that's my go to. The other thing is, too, if you're staying in central Paris, just walk as much as you can. It's a really walkable city and a great city to be surprised by things when you're on foot. And that kind of gives you more flexibility to explore different neighborhoods, too. And the thing is, you won't go more than a few blocks, especially in the city center, without seeing a metro stop. So you can always just hop on the subway if you get sick of walking.
Do they have an app for the city metro?
Yes. So the metro and the bus are both have the Bonjour RATP. So Bonjour RATP app, which is the best way to kind of explore, the subway, to explore buses. You can recharge. You can buy tickets. If you have an iPhone, you can buy tickets on the app. Or if you have an Android or you have a Navigo Pass, which is the physical card that you can buy at tobacconist shops around the city or in metro stations and a few other places like kiosks, things like that. You can recharge it using your app and your phone. So it's a really useful app to have.
Yeah, very convenient. So, when is the best time of year to visit Paris?
So I personally don't think there's a bad time to visit Paris. If you're coming for the first time, I wouldn't come in August. That would be my main thing because it's true that a lot of Parisians still do, go on vacation then. If I had to pick the very best time, I'd say kind of the shoulder seasons of April to May or kind of late September through early November are great times because the weather is still good. Paris has pretty mild weather overall, but it can get rainy or very cold during the, high winter months. But you won't pay as much as you will during the very high season, when you're talking about like, late May through beginning of July. And it won't be as crowded either. So those are my recommendations if it's your first time in Paris. But I think it's fun too on subsequent visits to come at different times of year and explore the city because I do think it's gorgeous year round and there's always something to do. There's always somewhere fun to go.
Thank you for that. I definitely want to talk about how Paris is such a big foodie destination and the gastronomy there is world renowned. So, do you have some favorite French dishes that you can talk about?
Absolutely. So I'm from Wisconsin. And most of my favorite French dishes are going to be cheese related. So if you look at my guide to the best restaurants in Paris or the best, foods to try while you're in France, I do have other options, including vegan options. It's very new for Paris, but the past few years we've started having good vegan options here too. But my favorites are all cheese based. So when you're in France, you absolutely have to try onion soup. French onion soup is just my absolute favorite. I'll eat it year round, but it's especially so good if you have it in like fall, winter when it starts to get cold. What you usually have is just like a crust on it with of cheese, like a few inches thick over like a crouton that you kind of almost like a creme brulee. You punch through to get to the other side. And then you have just this bowl, delicious, onion broth mixed in with crouton and cheese. I also love a croque monsieur sandwich, which is like a fancy grilled cheese. And what that is basically, it will have 2 pieces of toasted bread with melted cheese on the outside, like a softer cheese on the inside, and then usually ham in the middle. You can get a croque madame for usually like an extra alternative, in which case they will put a fried egg on the sandwich. That's a little too rich for my blood, but it is a big local favorite. And then, of course, there's just the wine and cheese. I love to make kind of a mini meal out of, smaller things that I have around the house. Baguettes, French bread with cheese from all over the country is one of my favorite meals to kind of have on the go or very quickly at the end of the day. If you're vegetarian, you'll find, or even if you're not, I'm not, and you'll find amazing Middle Eastern food here. There's great falafel. There are great Lebanese restaurants throughout the city, all sorts of just like wonderful food from all over the world, really. The one thing I have not found here is great Mexican food. I'm still looking.
Yes. So I definitely want to go over safety in Paris, which you already touched on a little bit, but how would you characterize safety in the city?
Safety in Paris is a lot like safety in a lot of big cities. So, like, I lived in New York before I was here. I spent some time living in London, and really the guidelines are pretty much the same. Keep an eye on your belongings. Don't take things out of the house that you can't afford to lose. I've been lucky in that the only crime I've experienced has been getting my cell phone stolen, but that's happened to me 3 times in 10 years. Now, I'm a little inattentive, but people will just pluck it right out of your purse. It's happened to me on the metro. I did have an attempted pickpocketing once, but I noticed it happening and that was enough to stop it. But again, just try not to forget your surroundings. That's when those experiences happened to me. I was zoning out or texting somebody, or not that you have to be to experience that, but in my experience, vigilance helped stop the pickpocketing, for example. So I think the biggest issue for visitors is going to be around places where visitors tend to go. So in front of the Louvre, in front of the Eiffel Tower, again, the train stations. I'm making them sound just absolutely horrible. And they don't have to be, but they are places that you should pay a little extra attention. Because, what I say to visitors is just if anybody comes up to you on the street and it's not immediately clear that you dropped something, just, wave them off or just keep going straight ahead. Don't engage with people. There are scams that involve even just you being passive as well. This one happened to my friend up at Sacre-Cœur, which is a big basilica at the top of Montmartre, where somebody just went up to her and started braiding a friendship bracelet around her wrist. And then what they do is, claim that you owe them money. And, it can be very awkward and difficult to get out of those situations with grace, which is why people end up just paying them, to basically go away. And really keeping an eye on your personal space is going to be important. Taking the metro is fairly safe, but again, late at night, especially if you're a single woman traveling alone or otherwise feel that you may be unsafe, you can always get a taxi. You download the G7 app. That's the main app for taxis in Paris. Make sure to test it out with your credit card or debit card before you actually need it. But it works like a rideshare app, and you can basically hail a taxi from your phone. And I like to have that in cases where I'm feeling like I might be unsafe or I'd rather take a car. So I think, for most people, those will be the main safety concerns to keep in mind.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned the rideshare app. Do you guys also have Uber there?
We have Uber, we don't have Lyft. So yeah, I would definitely suggest comparing and contrasting with the G7 app for particular rides, because with surge pricing and closed roads in Paris, a rideshare can take so long first to come and then to get you to your destination that a taxi can actually be faster, because taxis here can use the bus and carpool lanes, but rideshares can't. So I have the Uber app. I almost never use it. I'm much more likely to take an actual taxi, because for a comparable price, especially at rush hour. You get a more professional and faster service.
Yeah, very good to know. So, where are some of your favorite hidden gems in Paris from a local's perspective?
So, one of my favorite places to go in my neighborhood is a coffee shop called Peloton. And this is a big hub for the Anglophone community here. It's definitely bicycle themed, which is very exciting if you love the Tour de France. But it's also exciting if you're looking for a bicycle tour because the owner there, I believe, does incredible bike tours, really highly rated, of the Marais, of the Latin Quarter, of different corners of Paris, where you can get a bike, you can get a helmet, and he really knows what he's doing. So that's an establishment that I love, and they have great coffee and great pastries and things to nibble on. So it's not the most Parisian of destinations because you do get your to-go cup, Anglophone style of coffee rather than, a little French espresso to sit with for hours and hours. But it is a great place for when you're missing like a really big coffee or for when you want a bike tour of Paris. One of my favorite places to go on a summer evening is up in the 19th in the park, the Butte Chaumont, which is a bar and beer garden called Rosa Bonheur, like the painter. And it's inside the park, even after the park closes, it's open. And it's a really fun, kind of lively place to hang out, have a drink. But if you're in the garden, it's a lot more relaxed and you can even kind of see the park at night. And it's really stunning and a really fun place to go. I've even, had nights that ended up in a little bit of dancing there, although it's maybe not my top destination for dancing in Paris. And then, yeah, I think another really fun thing that I've been doing this last year has been taking pottery classes. And so my hidden gem on that side is a place called Clay Atelier, and that's in the 11th. And the cutest passage, it's a pedestrian cobblestone passage. And knowing just a little bit of French will open up a lot for you there. Because in my experience, several of the instructors did speak really excellent English. But in order to connect, to book, a day long class or a few hours of a class or a private class, it may help you to be able to just say pleasantries, ask the person on the phone if they speak English, things like that. So those are some of my favorite off the beaten path kind of hidden gems to go explore.
So, just to wrap up our Paris discussion, do you have any major tips for travelers visiting Paris?
So my biggest tip when you're visiting Paris is to leave yourself time to explore. And if you have the possibility of just wandering into, street that interests you and then taking the next turn that interests you and popping into this shop and that one, stopping at that cafe without kind of any ulterior motive except just to explore that neighborhood of the city and really make it yours. I think spending a morning or an afternoon or even a whole day like that can really make the difference and really make you feel like you're part of the city and that it belongs to you now. In my opinion, those are some of the most memorable times that you could spend in Paris because there are so many lovely surprises here, kind of around so many of the corners.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And for all of our listeners, as we wrap up this episode, make sure to check out all of Rachel's articles on Paris. She has so much valuable information on travellemming.com. And she also can create your own itinerary if you would like for her to build your trip for you. So make sure to check out those services too. Rachel, this has been so lovely to have you on the show. Thank you so much for telling us all about Paris and France. And I think listeners who are planning to head over to Paris could find a lot of awesome value out of everything that you've shared today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. I love being able to talk about Paris.
And again, to everyone listening, we'll be linking all of Rachel's articles in the show notes. And for listeners on YouTube, if you have any questions that you'd like to post in the comments, anything that we might have missed in this episode today that you'd like to know about, Rachel will be responding in the comments section. So make sure to add any questions that you have, and she'll be happy to respond to you as soon as this episode is posted.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Planning a trip to Paris might seem daunting, but if you want to take the stress out of planning and maximize every single minute spent in Paris, let Rachel plan your trip for you. Rachel creates custom self guided Paris itineraries, so you can get the local perspectives of the city along with all the can't miss sights Paris has to offer. But no matter what you're looking for, Rachel will make the ideal itinerary hand tailored to your interests. You can have a video meetup with her where she'll ask you questions to make sure she includes everything you could possibly want to do on your Paris visit. So if you value packing as much into your travels as possible, click the link or search Travel Lemming Paris Custom Itinerary to have Rachel create your personalized trip to Paris. Also, check out Rachel's dozens of free guides like where to stay in Paris, things to do in Paris, and much more. So, for our next segment, Nate and I are going to discuss what's new in travel, where we talk about some of the latest ideas and occurrences in the travel world. So, to start, I'm talking about Marriott. So, Marriott just bought Postcard Cabins and made a long term agreement with Trailborn, which are two outdoors focused boutique hotel brands. So, according to Travel Weekly, Marriott plans to launch an outdoorsy collection later this year, centered on upscale stays and nature immersive experiences. So the article says the company plans to, quote, fill the white space between basic accommodations and luxury lodges near national parks and other outdoor recreation areas. So for me, I mean, I wonder how this is going to affect the more rustic, kind of cozy stays from companies like Airbnb and VRBO that kind of separate those brands from the classic hotel stay feel. But I guess we'll see what Marriott comes up with at the end of this year. Nate, would you ever book a cabin in the woods from a major hotel company?
Oh, I'm a big fan of Marriott. So I stayed more than 100 nights in Marriott hotels last year. They've really grown a lot over the last 5 years. They've just been acquiring all these different hotel companies and expanding their footprint. They're the largest hotel company in the world. And I think a lot of people don't even, you may stay in a Marriott and not even know that it's Marriott because they have them in all these different brands that they've sort of acquired. And certainly, like, it's interesting that they're getting more into that outdoor space stuff. I'm really hopeful that they're going to do more of like the apartment style accommodation. Maybe they make some moves in that way because to compete a little bit more directly with Airbnb, because of course the big downside of staying in hotels, you don't have a kitchen. And they do have some brands that are like longer stay suites that have that. But it's interesting to see where the hotel market's moving, where you're kind of getting more of this, where they are making moves that they're trying to compete against those apartment rental places. Like a cabin would normally be something you would go to one of those sites for. So I think it's really interesting. As a Marriott member, I'm always happy to have more Marriott properties to choose from, particularly for their Bonvoy program because they have really good rewards program. So for my story, so TimeOut, which TimeOut, of course, is one of my favorite travel publications. They also operate markets in a number of cities around the world. To celebrate the beginning of 2025, they did this huge survey of, they talked to, let's see here, they talked to more than 18,000 different locals in cities around the world. And they quizzed them basically about like how much they like their city. And then they ranked the world's 50 greatest cities based upon that survey. And it's really interesting. I'm not going to go through all 50 of them. I did count though, and I've been to 37 of them, but there's 13 of them that I still have on my list. And I want to go to all of them, including their number one, which I've never been to and is on my list, hopefully for this year, which is Cape Town, South Africa. And they sort of talk about why Cape Town locals really love it for its food scene, for its natural beauty, and just for the happiness of the locals generally. So Cape Town was number one, but I'll go ahead and read out the top 10 real quick. Number two, personal favorite, Bangkok. Number three, New York City. Number four, Melbourne, Australia. Number five, London. Six, New Orleans. Next was Mexico City, Porto, Portugal, Shanghai, and Copenhagen. Really an interesting list. Lots of different cities on there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have not been to 3 of those, but I have been to Cape Town. I actually turned 21 in Cape Town, crazy enough, and it is one of the most stunning cities I've ever seen with the mountains right there, and there's such amazing wine land, safari land nearby. There's so much to do, so definitely add that to your list, Nate.
As an American turning 21, like, I feel like it's almost wrong to do that outside of the US
I
because
know.
it's like, you're not actually like, what does it matter
No,
when you're
people the
not?
whole time were like, "Why are you so excited?" Like, the drinking age here is 18, but I had a blast.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. All right, well, next up, let's talk about our Travel Lemming perspectives. So at Travel Lemming, our team of dozens of local expert travelers, we have a section of the site called Perspectives, and this is where we just share our own personal perspectives on travel. It's a really interesting section to just kind of scroll through if you're in the mood for, reading something interesting about travel. And Betty and I each came with a couple of our favorites of the latest pieces on Travel Lemming perspectives. So my first one is by Laura Phelan And it's called I Definitely Look Like a Tourist When I Travel. I Don't Care. And she basically talks about how a lot of advice online, including some other perspectives on travel lemming that she references, suggests that while you're traveling abroad, you should try to blend in, you should try to kind of dress like a local. And she kind of says that she had on a recent trip to London and Iceland, she started to go down the path of trying to do this. And then at some point gave up and said, no, I'm just going to lean into being the tourist that I am. Why is it so bad to look like a tourist anyway? I am a tourist, so I look like a tourist. Big deal. And she was like, "It felt exhausting to try to do that, and that's just who I am anyway." And she's like, "Look, when people visit my hometown, I'm flattered to have tourists there." And she does kinda qualify that by saying, you wanna avoid becoming a jerk or becoming one of those tourists that, like the woman who famously sort of followed the geisha along the street with a camera in Kyoto or did things that were disruptive. But she's like, she thinks that if you're trying not to look like a tourist, then you're not becoming vulnerable, you're not being curious, and you're not kind of recognizing the fact that you are not in your home place. So I thought that was an interesting perspective that kind of ran counter to some of the other perspectives that we published.
Yeah, I honestly think that being a tourist is shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. I mean, honestly, whenever I go somewhere and it's very obvious that I'm not from there, people are really helpful. Like locals I see kind of go out of their way to give me their opinions on what I should do and where I should go. And so I don't think there's any shame in being a tourist. And I really like this piece from Laura for sure. All right. So what I brought to the table is Rachel's article titled I Tried a Writing Retreat in the Stables of a French Castle. So obviously, I did a deeper dive into Rachel's pieces when we decided to do this Paris interview together. And I thought this one was so unique. So she wanted an experience that would reinvigorate her love for writing and also just for life in general. So she booked a stay in the stables of this old castle south of Paris. And her room was totally remodeled into this beautiful studio apartment, totally redone and cozy. And she had no responsibilities or chores to focus on except for writing for, I believe it was 4 days. So she kind of discusses the stay and the process of the retreat in her article and the pros and cons of it. And it's super cool because she actually was working on a novel at the time and was kind of doing this to work on her writer's block that she was feeling. She actually wrote over 30 different fairy tales on this retreat, some of which made it into one of her novels. So the link to which is in the article and will also be in the show notes for this episode. So yeah, this piece definitely got me thinking about booking a writer's retreat for myself.
I think it's super interesting. So I'm looking right now at the hotel that she stayed in, which is Les Domaines des Fleurs, but it really does look like a
Yeah.
castle. I mean, this is a beautiful, absolutely beautiful property. But what's really impressive about this and why, if you're planning a trip to France, you might want to pay attention to this because it's a really good find by her because it's like, I'm looking at their availability calendar and it is not expensive for how good it looks. And I mean, it has like 9.0 out of 10 reviews and it's just a stunning place. And I mean, I'm seeing nights on here for as little as $126 a night. She said she paid about $150 a night, but I mean, for a room that's in a castle like that, that's a pretty awesome deal. So if you're planning a trip around France, maybe go check that out.
Yeah, and she talked about that in the article that this was in 2021 when she went and did it. And she said that the prices have just not fluctuated at all really since she went several years ago, 4 years ago now. So, yeah, it seems like a really great deal for what it is. It looks beautiful. Well, that's all for today. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for our Paris discussions. Remember to like and subscribe. We've got way more episodes coming your way soon. And we will see you on the next episode of the Travel Lemming podcast.